So, it's very possible that new attacks are in the works. I mean, Russian military drafts have been increased, and the northern border of Ukraine is vulnerable to a potential new danger from Belarus. So, the outcome of the battle in Ukraine this winter is therefore quite unpredictable in light of all these factors. In December, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky flew to Washington, D.C. more than 300 days after Russia's invasion of his country to discuss what the next 300 days might bring. And after their meeting, the two men made it plain that they believe a new chapter in the battle has begun. Fears of a standstill are on the rise as Russia deploys more troops to the front lines and begins a devastating air campaign against civilian targets. However, it was still unclear how to resolve the fighting as Zelensky left Washington for a lengthy and perilous return trip to Ukraine. Now the question is, what can be done? Hey there, hi there guys, glad to have you join us today on Econify. If you're new to the channel, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon right there. And also fasten your seatbelts and let me take you on a ride as we talk about Ukraine, Russia, and the ongoing war which we all thought would be over by now, and what could be in store for both sides. You don't want to miss this, so let's see what we've got. Well, the message is very clear. The war won't end until Ukraine kinda sorta reaches the borders of 1991. In the east, the situation is comparable to that of World War II's fiercest battles. Fire, shells, rockets, artillery, the works. And in Kiev, as you'd probably see, they're not particularly at risk as other regions, but the Russians have begun to utilize rockets in those areas. And since Russia began their barrage, roughly 50% of Ukraine's power generation has been lost, leaving the country in a literal state of darkness. This isn't a movie, it's real life, and one must not overlook the psychological toll that these blackouts have taken on the population. These blackouts are mainly due to Iranian drones, which, according to some, aren't so great. But that doesn't matter because it isn't necessary, as long as they strike their targets in large enough numbers. And now there's the possibility that Russia will begin making those systems on its own, which would be a major setback for Ukraine. But if Iran decides to supply short and medium-range ballistic missiles, such as the Zulfikar system, that would be a major issue, because if it did, it would be essentially giving Russia permission to continue its relentless assault on the towns and infrastructure of Ukraine. However, this too is illusory, and it's very likely that the Russians are already rebuilding in terms of both ammunition and troops. Putin mentioned that Russia has around 200,000 troops in preparation for a new offensive, which some analysts predict could begin as soon as the end of January and as late as March if they're very lucky, but it seems that's more likely in February. Tensions between Russia and Ukraine have risen considerably. Well, they've always been there, but Putin's visit to Belarus in December has gotten Ukraine feeling very uneasy. Threats of an invasion from the north are pretty real, and that could come any time. I mean, even now. It's really no news that Belarus has already given the Russians far too many of its guns and ammo to mount a significant attack or even participate in one. Now, if Putin manages to seize the remaining territory of Donetsk province, he will have a legitimate claim to victory across the entire Donbass. And for example, if you were the Ukrainian commander assessing your options, you would conclude that Melitopol is the most audacious place for an offensive, since your high-mass rocket launchers would be within striking distance of Russian supply lines stretching from Russia to Ukraine. Still, it's important to remember that to the Ukrainian people, their country is more than just a piece of land. Moreover, Russian actions have led to over 95% of the public advocating for total demilitarization, and most likely, the big mistake happened on the 24th of February in 2014 in Crimea. As many Ukrainians would recall, was the worst possible day for the tragedy to take place, since that's when it became apparent that no one was willing to bargain anymore. So what Zelensky is referring to now, and what is plainly seen, seems to be a peaceful return of Crimea. And if Putin is deposed, which is not likely, or the system changes, it's safe to believe that he means that the current status of Crimea will be renegotiated from the ground up, which could be a start to ensuring peace in the region. In my opinion, the Ukrainians have two options for launching a massive offensive. The first is in northern Ukraine, around the city of Kharkiv, but the same logistical difficulties as in Kherson arise due to the river's few crossing points. The second plan of attack would be a southern one, and its goal would be to sever Russia's land connection to Crimea in order to seize that region. Well, we can't say it's impossible, but at the moment, a positive outcome is highly unlikely. Why? Well, because Russian artillery would be well positioned to repel a Ukrainian invasion, and the territory where the Ukrainian army would be attacking is perfectly suited for Russian artillery. It might even have all the makings of a rematch at the Battle of Kherson, except this time the Russians won't have to deal with the logistical problems caused by the restricted number of crossings they have over the Dnipro River. However, the gains and losses will all be the same, with entire mechanized companies being wiped out, endless scenes of ambulance convoys, and new cemeteries springing up across Ukraine. And eventually, the Russians would benefit greatly from such a death toll. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not totally impossible because pressure from the Western coalition and domestic politics in Ukraine to make up for land lost to the Russian fire in Donbass may force the country to launch an offensive anyways. The challenge for Russian leadership would be when and where to launch an attack, but mainly the availability of Russian artillery ammo will determine the timeline. Also, if snowfall totals are high, Russia may launch an attack then, or they may wait until the mud season has passed and launch an offensive in the spring. Don't forget, there's also the reservists' need for training time, which also plays a role in the timeline as well. By giving the reserve forces more time to prepare, the Kremlin can boost their efficiency and decrease the number of casualties, mitigating political risk. And this could be a problem for Ukraine, which only strengthens some wartime analysis that Ukraine might just lose this war. The outcome will depend on what kind of pressures the Russian government believes are crucial. Military consideration may favor waiting until the end of the spring mud season in March or April, but the pressure from domestic politics for a quick victory may prove too great to ignore. Not to mention that the Kremlin has prioritized military over political concerns so far, suggesting Russia will only launch a limited offensive this winter. Given China's expanding significance and influence in recent years, the country's stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an important factor in the evolution of the crisis and the preservation or breakdown of the global status quo. In recent years, the economic, diplomatic, and military ties between the two countries have grown even stronger than they were before. China has refused to urge Russia to stop the invasion, issuing routine, dispassionate statements about advising moderation within the context of what some would call pro-Russian pseudo-neutrality. What they're primarily doing is to blame NATO and the United States in particular and single them out for criticism for their roles in allegedly escalating tensions in the region. Some US intelligence officials claim that China has been keeping a close eye on the Russian incursion and may be reconsidering its strategy for a possible conflict with Taiwan. Since China does not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation, Chinese ambassador to France, Liu She, recently remarked that the Chinese Communist Party does not view the incursion between Russia and Ukraine as being analogous to their situation with Taiwan, which is pretty tricky considering that many countries from around the world consider Taiwan an independent country. Top Taiwanese officials are concerned about the growing similarities between Putin and Jinping's leadership styles as they view the Russian attack as proof of the severity of the threat they face. The criticism that has followed Putin's invasion of Ukraine is further evidence that his decision was made unilaterally and that this is a man's mission disguised as a national mission. So there is little doubt that the conflict in Ukraine and its implications will leave both sides depleted in fundamental ways. Yet the result of the war and its impact on Putin's term in the Kremlin remain difficult to predict. In addition to the years it would take to rebuild their military, both sides will have to deal with the escalating economic crisis that typically follows a conflict, and Moscow's rising political isolation, which will make it even more reliant on its relationship with China. Putin still seems determined to regain territory in Ukraine that he views as ancient Russian land. However, Russia is paying a steep price for this action. Well, both sides are paying heavily, but when is this war gonna stop? Nobody knows. Is Ukraine gonna win or lose the war? Nobody knows. Is Russia gonna win or lose the war? Nobody knows. Too many questions with no answers. And ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of yet another video. Please like, subscribe, and tell us what you think about the war in the comments, and do you think it's gonna end anytime soon? But as for now, I look forward to having you tune into our next video, and until then, I'll be seeing ya.